Good evening, boys and ghouls. Welcome to the channel. I am D, your humble host and prodigious pathfinder on the perilous peaks of cinema history. In our journey through horror, we have arrived at the 90s, a decade marked by jaded irony and a social complacency that honestly didn't age that well. Also, it wasn't a great time for horror films. The genre kinda ran itself ragged in the late 80s, and there was a general disinterest. However, there were a few good movies made that helped reignite the boilers. Some of the movies that I've chosen for this list can be argued are not technically horror films. However, I find them representative for the period, and at the end of the day, it's still my list. We'll see if you agree. This is my pick for the top 10 horror movies of the 90s. Blair Witch Project. Few movies are as representative of late 90s horror as this one. This is the story of 3 film students who vanish in the woods while filming a documentary on a local witch legend. The movie presented is apparently their own video recordings, recovered at a later time. It wasn't the first found footage movie, but it was the one that got a trend started. For the next 10 years the market will be inundated with low-budget shaky cam flicks, and I can't say how relieved I am that that particular trend has died down a bit. Still, this movie is not without its merits. It felt fresh at the time and reinvigorated a genre that was going through a bumpy phase. It has also got a few iconic scenes and, I'll admit, an ending that is pretty damn good. Blair Witch Project might not be my type of movie, but it's still a good film for what it is, and stylistically, it's an icon for its time. The Ring. This was the movie that truly made Asian horror a mainstay in the West and helped pave the way for later movies such as The Grudge and the American remakes of these. The story revolves around a cursed videotape that makes whoever watches it the target of a murderous spirit, a concept that would inspire several filmmakers in the following years. Some people argue that the American remake by Gore Verbinski is a stronger movie. I don't really agree, but by all means feel free to discuss it. The Ring offered atmospheric horror at a time when the West was too jaded for such things, and showed us there was still a need for it. The world might have changed, but Ringo is still as creepy as ever. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. This was a late inclusion to the list. The first time I saw it I wasn't too impressed, but as I just recently rewatched it I changed my mind. Directed by Kenneth Branagh, who also stars as Frankenstein, this movie stays a lot truer to the source material than most versions that came before it. This makes it a bit slower and puts a lot of emphasis on Frankenstein's life and upbringing, as well as the monster's journey of self-discovery. The monster is played by Robert De Niro, a bit of an odd choice, but he takes the role seriously and does a fine job. Allegedly, Columbia Pictures at one point wanted Tim Burton to direct this, and the monster was to be played by Arnold Schwarzenegger. This could have been a very different movie. On the whole, it's a sad and romantic tale of obsession, revenge, and human shortcomings. It tries to be the definite version of Mary Shelley's book, and be that as it may, it certainly does the story justice. During the mid-90s, Wes Craven did all he could to show his dissatisfaction with the horror genre. With New Nightmare he returned to the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, which had been thoroughly run into the ground by New Line Cinema in his absence. 10 years after the release of the first movie, it was time for Freddy to be scary again, rather than just a punchline he had become. In true 90s fashion, this is a meta-movie of all things. The actors play themselves as Freddy starts haunting them in the real world, which gives plenty of opportunity for self-reflection and sarcastic commentary. It's as cheesy as you'd expect, but it's definitely an interesting movie. New Nightmare was not the Elm Street we expected, but it was admittedly the one we deserved. Sleepy Hollow. Yeah, I can hear you. Of course it's debatable if this should be considered a horror movie at all, but I choose to include it for my own reasons. Tim Burton's adaptation of this Washington Irving classic is an incarnation of gothic elegance, a loving callback to the movies of a bygone age. In this version, Ichabod Crane, played by Johnny Depp, is a police inspector sent to the small town of Sleepy Hollow to investigate a string of unsolved murders. While most townfolk are as skeptical of him as he is of them, he finds a partner and romantic companion in Katrina Van Tassel, played by Gothic cult darling Christina Ricci. And yes, the age gap between them is perhaps slightly wider than I'm entirely comfortable with, but let's just ignore that for now. With its deep, foggy backgrounds, crisp autumn feel, and indeed a very real top-lopping horseman of the headless persuasion, Sleepy Hollow is a movie that's just perfect at this time of year. Candyman. This tale of an undead killer with a hook for a hand who can allegedly be summoned by saying his name 5 times may at a glance look like a straggler from the slasher era. In some regards this is true, but there's a lot more than that to this movie. The plot follows grade student Helen Lyle, played by Virginia Madsen, who accidentally summons the murderous spirit when researching local urban legends. Tony Todd does a great job as Candyman. Even when he's not doing something scary, he has this imposing presence. At its core, the movie is about social divides of segregation and racial injustice. It's a grim and atmospheric film, every bit as sad as it's scary. Especially for the time it was made, Candyman is a gem that shouldn't be missed. Braindead, also known as Dead Alive, is often called the bloodiest movie ever made, which might well be true. It was directed by Peter Jackson a few years before he would be overhyped for the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Braindead defies explanation. I mean, there is a plot in there, but I'd be damned if I could recount it. Although, let's be honest, this is not the kind of movie you watch for the story anyway. It's a full-throttle, balls-to-the-wall splatterfest meant for people with a very particular brand of humor, like me. But this one is a bit too much even for me at times. If you're a fan of gory comedies, I say give this a watch. Just be aware that you'll probably lose your appetite along the way.
I see dead people.
Director M. Night Shyamalan was on the top of the world for a while after making this one. The Sixth Sense is one of those genre-redefining movies that only come once every decade at most. This is a tale of a kid who can see ghosts and a down-on-his-luck child psychologist who tries to help him. It's a gripping and artistic piece with some creepy moments and most notably a big old twist ending, which I won't give away in case you somehow don't know it yet. Let's just say that it's quite unexpected and definitely makes you want to watch the movie again. And that was the main legacy of this film, as after this everyone wanted to include a twist ending, whether it made sense or not. Anyway, Sixth Sense is exquisitely well crafted, and as trendsetters go, it's the biggest power player of the decade. Having washed his hands of Freddy with his new nightmare, Wes Craven proceeded with his apparent quest to euthanize the slasher genre for good. With Scream, he set out to expose the formulas and shortcomings of the trend in the most self-ironic 90s way possible. The movie follows a group of young people targeted by a masked killer, discussing the cliches of slasher movies even as they repeat them. While the movie may have succeeded in highlighting the many flaws of the slasher trend, it failed miserably to put an end to the genre. Instead, it kinda rekindled it, which led to a string of second-rate neo-slashers like the I Know What You Did Last Summer franchise, and parody films like Scary Movie and all the garbage that came on the heels of that one. Scream is a worthwhile movie though, even if the tone is a bit obnoxious at times. Either way, you just can't get more 90s than this. Ah, the irony. Before we unveil the top spot, here's a couple of honorable mentions. Bram Stoker's Dracula, much like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, is one of those movies that is just fine but still don't really do it for me. Perhaps this too will grow on me one day. We'll see. Wolf is a pretty decent werewolf flick. A bit on the forgettable side maybe, and not entirely timeless. Still, not a bad movie though. From Dusk Till Dawn. Now here's one that I really love. I had it on the list for a while, but I wasn't sure if I could really call it a horror film. Great stuff though. Same goes for Tremors, Misery, and Interview with a Vampire. All fine movies, just not right for this list. Now, On to number 1, and it's gonna be a controversial one, I'm sure. Silence of the Lambs. Many would say that this is not a horror film at all, but really. It's a story about the hunt for a serial killer who's trying to DIY himself a suit out of female skin, not to mention the hyper-intelligent cannibal who'll get under anyone's skin. It's true though that it was not entirely meant to be a horror film. At the time of its release, the horror genre was dead in the water and the studios wouldn't touch it with a 39.5-foot pole. So, Silence of the Lambs was branded a psychological thriller and given a strong cast headed by Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins, who does such an amazing job in the role of Hannibal Lecter that you tend to forget he's actually not the villain of the movie. In many ways, the movie's creepy tone and unabashed visual style came to rejuvenate the genre. Whether it was meant to be horror or not, horror itself changed to accommodate it. Say what you will, I consider it to be at the very least an honorary horror movie, and in that regard, an easy pick for the top spot on the list. And that was my pick for the top 10 horror films of the 90s. Next time we enter the new millennium and inch our way ever closer to Halloween. Join me there as the journey continues. Thanks for watching, catch you on the flip side.